Good morning, everyone. My name is Aisha Mills, and I am just so honored to be here with you this morning to be in keynote conversation with my dear friend who I admire so much, Malia Lazu. This morning, we are going to start off talking political and probably end talking political just because of the climate that we're in, but really because we have with you today someone who understands the hearts and the souls and really the economic interest of people because of her experience with a small p of politics and for so many years of her career. And she has brought all that she has learned about communities and what matters and how to really truly move people and empower them to all facets of her life, from what I like to say I've dubbed from the streets to the C-suite. And so Malia, congratulations, on your honor. And I'm just so honored to be here with you doing this conversation. So welcome, and welcome to everyone who's tuning in today.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. And yes, thank you. Last night was very special to receive an award from BECMA and to be there with Shagun and so many others via the interwebs. It was very humbling last night, and it's an honor to be with you this morning.
So Malia, let's just jump right into it. You know, when we were having this conversation this morning with BECMA, and at least in my experience, and for those who don't know me, I have spent most of my career probably in a little bit of opposite land as Malia. I started off working in democratic politics and have been in institution and establishment trying to make change for Black people, queer people, and women, etc., versus having been in my early days in the grassroots. And I know the conversations that I've always been in, Malia, tend to get, when we talk about money and we talk about power and we talk about economics, when we talk about our people, Black people, for me, it always hasn't felt like a conversation that was had, at least in my political circles, about how people can have their own agency. And that's the thing I've most just respected about your lens. So I thought that it would be fun to start off today, if you could just share a bit about your story and how you began your career and just some of the insights and lessons learned, because I think that's really foundational for people to understand where you've come from, to know, you know, kind of the impact you've made and where you're going.
Absolutely. And I love where I love this story because it starts in Boston. I mean, my life started in Hawaii. You know, I'm a Gemini, all of those things. But as far as my political life and my career and the work I've done, it started right here in Boston. And I decided that I was at Emerson College, and I decided that I was going to have a hip hop concert to register people and young people to vote. This was during Rock the Vote days, was just getting started. And I wasn't able to get a permit from the city of Boston. And that seemed very normal to people. It was like, well, right, Boston doesn't do hip hop concerts. Mayor Menino's not going to give you a permit to do, you know, and it was all, and I guess it was all very just accepted. And I think for me, it ignited this idea of agency and this idea of, well, what does it mean that I can walk into City Hall and be told that I'm not getting a permit, not because I can't do a concert responsibly, but because the type of people that I'm bringing to the concert is not welcome in the Boston Commons. And so that just really ignited my agency. And, you know, I'm Black, Puerto Rican, Italian, so it's hard to not take things personal, all of that stuff. And it sent me on starting Mass Vote, which was really, you know, the pathway into my career.
So Malia, you have been an organizer, and you talk so eloquently about being an organizer. And it is not the first thing we think is not, oh, someone who's doing grassroots organizing and engaging gang members and you know, folks on the ground is the person that is also going to be thinking about financial tools and solutions for same communities to lift their lives. I want to kind of get a little bit more from you about strategies employed just in when you were forming Mass Vote, and then you kind of the work that you did after that before you ended up at MIT. Talk to us about what you were learning as a young person, perhaps, around strategy for change and offering communities agency and ladders, and how that evolved for you over time.
If you're not evolving in your thinking as you're doing this work, if you're doing the same tactics, I've been an organizer for 23 years and, and counting. And my tactics have changed significantly. The places I do the work, my targets have changed significantly. And it's not only because you learn things, right? But it's also because you evolve, and where you want to spend your time to change evolves. And I think, one of the most important lessons I received was getting solidly trained in organizing. I went to union organizing trainings, NAACP organizing trainings, and things like that. And so I understood the tactics and strategies that it took to change. And I would say that one of the things that is a basis for any organizer is that you're developing relationships so that those relationships collectively understand their power and can act on it. And, so once you start doing that in communities and you start peeling back this onion of oppression, right? Because it often starts like, we need food programs, right? We need better education. And you start peeling back this onion and boom, you're left with who decides, right? And that's your ultimate target for organizing. And so I think while I've done things differently and in different places, the alchemy, right? The tool that I use is this idea of relationships towards collective power.
You said who decides. You're thinking about relationships and ultimately who decides. So much of how your work has evolved has been trying to help institutions shake up the way they think about who should be deciding and who's included, and who is at the table. And you've shared with me a quote. I think it's a Peter Drucker quote that really, the first time you read it, it kind of hit you. And I want you to share that with folks and give us a sense of how you're thinking about the work and economic tools and just strategy generally grew through that.
Yeah, that quote, I want to set the context for a second. I had been working for Harry Belafonte for about 7 years, and I was coming back to Boston to go to MIT as a Mel King Fellow. And I was doing that because I was burnt out. I was working in 26 cities. We had trained 3,000 plus gang members and at-risk youth in Kingian nonviolence. And we were working with them to help start legitimate businesses, just really on the ground organizing with youth organizers who were there, who had the relationships necessary. And for years, we were just slogging at this problem. And I'm at MIT and, I'm getting a chance to read again and things like this. And Peter Drucker had this quote, and it said, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And I was tired, because I had been doing national organizing for years at the level of, Harry Belafonte, who is living history and who you have to produce for, right? And I was tired and burnt out, and I saw this quote and I started crying. And the reason why I started crying is because I had spent so many years, 7 but plus, when I think about me starting Mass Vote and, and the work I did in DC around politics. And I had spent so many years trying to implement strategy. culture that after 400 years has yet to recognize my humanity. And I realized why I was tired. I realized why I was burnt out. And I realized why such good strategy was falling on deaf ears. And it was then when I came back, about 8 years ago, I guess. I think I've been back now in Boston. That I decided that I had to start doing culture work, and that we needed a new culture there. And so yeah, that was that sort of philosophical shift for me. And what you realize is that when you look at the civil rights movement, not through a strategic lens, of which it was strategically genius, right? But when you look at it through a cultural lens, what you see is that they created a culture of Black liberation, whether it was in the Black Panthers or whether it was in SNCC, right? They said, we are the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That is making a claim about a very big claim about how you want your culture to be. This is going to be a nonviolent culture, right? And so we don't talk about it in that way, right? We talk about, well, there was the March on Washington and there was the this and that. But when I was working for Harry and talking to Diane Nash one day, and they were talking about how James Bevel was down in Birmingham, and John Lewis was over there doing Edmund Pettus, and I said, well, how did you guys decide this? Like, who got to lead? Like, and she just started laughing, and she was like, it was whoever who didn't have a job because they had the time and they could collect unemployment. And I thought, I have watched bloodbaths about leadership, about who's organizing. But these were college students who were living together because they didn't have separate, they were sharing food together. And one of the most touching things that Diane Nash ever said to me was that she saw that in what we were developing in the gathering, was that, we wouldn't have our own hotel rooms because we couldn't afford it, right? So like we had organizers, the girls were in one room, the boys were in another, right? As we would head down to Mississippi, Alabama, and what have you. And that was culture. We were developing culture. The last thing I want to say about that is A Force More Powerful. It's a very, very amazing movie. I'd suggest everyone watch it. A Force More Powerful has this scene during the Birmingham Children's March. And it's the children are marching and they're hit with hoses. And they immediately obviously disperse. And when you watch it, there was a group there and they locked arms and they started singing freedom, freedom. That was the culture that we, right? That, and then other people came back. Again, not everyone's going to stick with you all the time. We can't possibly need a 1,000,000-man march every time we want to change something, right? Like we actually have to have a small group of people who will keep it going. And that's what organizers are.
You talk about culture versus tactic, which is what I have always just been so in admiration and awe of your ability to try to have them simultaneously, right? So when you think about strategy overall, Malia says, okay, well, wait a minute. Yes, I've got some great ideas, which we're about to talk about a little bit about kind of some of the things you've implemented. We could do A, B, C, D, and E. And in order for this strategically to work, we also need to assess culture. And the way that we talk about, as titled with this conversation, our lexicon, are the way that we talk about, the way that we think about what the problems are, what the challenges are with culture, so that then we can evolve that so that the tactics land. Fascinating to me, Malia, the way that you think about all of this. And I would love for you to kind of share a little bit about, your journey. You've come from organizing, you went to MIT, you started advising corporations on their diversity, equity, and inclusion, but really their culture work in order to get to some real outcomes with diverse communities. I would love it if you could share with us some of your, just give us some anecdotes and things that you witnessed, bore witness to around the challenges of culture and lexicon that have gotten you, thinking a little differently than maybe you did 15 years ago.
Absolutely. Another story, that's not mine, but one I use a lot is a story about a giraffe and an elephant, and they were friends. And they would hang out, they would go to the watering hole, they would chit chat. And then one day the giraffe tells the elephant, come over, like come to my house, like let's watch, the cricket or whatever. And so the elephant goes to the giraffe's house, and the giraffe is so excited, and he cleans his house, he puts nuts, he gets rid of mice, he's like, the elephant's gonna love it here. And then the elephant starts to try to get in, and he can't fit in his house because his house was built for a giraffe, right? It's a giraffe's house. That's what culture is. And that's why you have to design a strategy that recognizes, is this a hummingbird house? Is this a giraffe house, right? What is this? Is this an elephant's house? And because you can't start inviting others in if your place is actually uninviting. And often, because it's in corporate or in institutions, we can throw money at problems, and we can measure the hell out of anything. And so that's what we do, right? We're like, there's a problem. Let's somehow define the problem in a way that we can then quantifiably measure it. Because if we can't measure it, it doesn't exist. We have a very capitalist view, actually, right? Like it's something that doesn't sit in your family. Like you've never asked, or at least I hope that you're not constantly asking for that kind of reinforcement in your personal relationships, right? You spent X less money on me this month than you did last month, right? There are certain things that don't have those quantifiables, but that's the lens, that's the culture we're in, right? So that's how we look at problem solving. And the fact of the matter is, when you get to behavior change, when you get to culture change, what we have to understand is that what that giraffe's house is it's all of the institutional, structural, and implicit bias that sits in a company. So it's just, so I think that's where I come. I come at it from that angle. And to tell a funny story, I was working with a company, and they were, well, it's the Foundation for Business Equity. I'm sure Glenn won't mind me mentioning them, and they're, a huge fan of BECMA. And we were working with their senior advisors, which was a group of primarily white, primarily cisgendered male business experts. And they were going to work with Black businesses to help Black and Brown businesses through technical assistance. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to have a conversation with these essays around institutional, structural, and implicit bias, because we wanted them to be aware that they were not entering to business as usual, right? That they were actually going to have to think about things differently, that they were going to have to be aware of not only the bias that they may have, but the biases that, that the Black business owner may have against themselves, and definitely the biases that the business community on a whole is going to face. And so we were talking about microaggressions, and I was giving some examples, and one of the essays just did like this. And I was like, wait, it's not like hand holding, like, what, you okay? What's going on? And he goes, I just did two of those things that you've listed as microaggressions, thinking that I was actually like being open and like whatever. And, we started laughing about it because this was a safe space, right? This was a place where he could feel it. I knew that his guilt and shame wasn't going to help us at all, right? And it wasn't going to help him be a better ally. So there was no need to necessarily be like, well, what did you say? But what we did do is we talked about how to start observing language, right? Lexicon, how to start observing how you talk about things and how you assume everyone's down with what you're talking about. And, and that's not just about race. I mean, this happens in class when people want to talk about family vacations. And like some people don't have family vacations. People want to talk about children and assume, Aisha, how's your husband doing? When are you having kids? Not realizing, that you're not going to have a husband most likely. And that, your kids are going to be just fine when you choose to have them. Right. Like it's those types of assumptions that end up othering people, So I think, my anecdotes or the stories that I have are reflective of that, of really just not people saying like, oh, well, too bad, right? But like people just being like, oh my God, no, I only talk to so-and-so about football, but it's because, like making those connections. And the one that we need to make the most is people with disabilities. I think, people with disabilities our entire culture is ableist, including Black and brown culture.
Mm-hmm. The way that you talk about, I've learned so much from you, and the way that you talk about the need for a new lexicon, especially in the way we do our work to try to support minority business enterprises, to try to help bridge the racial wealth gap, as we think about the way that capitalism attempts to intervene in those challenges. Notice I say intervene in those challenges as opposed to problem solve, because that's a whole other drama. But Malia, share with the people the way that you think about the current challenges with Lexicon, especially around benevolence and charity versus actual, access and people being able to have their own agency to thrive, because I think that's really the crux of your consulting work and so much of the work that you've done inside of a corporation.
Yes. And, my last little plug, I'll do a plug, but my last op-ed in Banker and Tradesman, the headline was called "Diversity is not a cost center." And
say that again.
Diversity is not a cost center. And the reason why that was the first op-ed in this series that I'm doing beyond CRA, which is Community Reinvestment Act, which was the act that made banks be nice to people of color, basically, and poor people. And that's really, we find these solutions and they end up sitting either in checking boxes or in charity. And so often when we're talking about Black and brown, the conversation comes around charity, right? Well, this is where we give, this is where the foundation sits. This is where, but at the end of the day, the most American thing we can do together is make money. And I'm not a huge capitalist. You know this, Aisha, right? But what I know, right, is that if I'm going to be equal in America, then that means I got an equal shot like you, not only to make money, but to hold on to that wealth. And, that's the change. That's the lexicon that we need to switch. Right now, when we talk about others, we maintain the power dynamic, right? Is that, well, how do we get them to be more like white middle class? And let's be honest, that's the norm. When we're talking about normal America, it's white middle class is who we're talking about. And that, that is very dangerous, because not only does it put a lot of pressure on white people to all of a sudden be all things to all people, which they have failed at, but it also ignores the resources that other communities have. And, to move beyond race, to talk about gender, we know, right, that masculine and feminine energy shows up differently, that it organizes differently, right? And that both are important. And so this idea that, we should all be like our CEO, becomes a dangerous model. So this idea of this new lexicon is for us to actually create language, traditions, and culture, that doesn't reinforce keeping up with the Joneses, which really means how white middle class can you be, right? But that understands that there's traditions from all cultures that can help build a thriving economy and a thriving democracy. And so let's use that. You know, when we talk about the Freedmen's Bank, you know, and we're like, oh, the Freedman Bank failed. Well, let's talk about that for a second. And that's going to be my next column coming up on Banker and Tradesman end of November.
Yes.
I did, you know, I was doing a little research because I wanted to talk about it as an example. And this was back in 1846. There was over 70,000 customers. And there was over, I want to say it was 66 million in assets. Okay. Oh, a white board member takes out a fraudulent loan that tanks the bank. They ask the government to intervene. They bring in Frederick Douglass, okay, to try to help save this Black bank. The government does not intervene. And 66,000 Black people, newly freed, who have been able to get together 66 million, you know, like if we start thinking about this, right, like lost their money.
Wow.
Right? So, but yet when we talk about Black and brown, we're talking about charity, and yet we don't need charity, right? Because the story should actually be around colonization and around the extraction of manifest destiny and the extraction that the European Enlightenment experiment did. And this is where I think I'm unique in a certain sense to talk about this, because I grew up in Hawaii, and Hawaii has that lexicon. We talk about that. The reason why Hawaiian people don't have land is because they were killed by smallpox. And you learn that. I didn't get my first American history lesson until I was in high school. Before then, I was learning about what happened to the Hawaiian people and the people in Polynesia and colonization, and how amazing those cultures were, right? And how they knew about the stars, and right, like, and how they had agriculture and all of it, right? And then the white experience came with a very different lexicon to me. And it wasn't one of aspiration, but it was one of distrust and violence. And, you know, I think that where we are now, it's not about, you know, kill whitey, but it is about an acknowledgement that we have mislabeled our history. We've gotten the narrative wrong. And that if we stop benevolence and stop charity, what we will get back to is what those newly freed Black people were able to do, which was build a bank that had hundreds of millions of dollars in today's dollars in it, just in a few years after getting free.
Preach. Yes. Yes.
Sorry,
yes.
I got all fired up.
No, I mean, this is exactly what the people need to hear this morning. And I want you, this is
Tulsa I'm sorry. Now I'm just going to say one more thing. Like, we all just started learning about, you know, the Tulsa massacre, and, you know, and this conference is talking about Black Wall Street. And I think that's a lexicon we want to change, right? Like, when Shagun had said, what is a Black Wall Street? The first thing the press did was like, Black Wall Street in Boston. Where is it? Is it in Roxbury? Is it in Mattapan? And like, the idea is like, well, it's the 21st century, it's 2020. Black Wall Street is wherever there's Black people. We should be thriving. We should be having our businesses. And that's what Shagun was, you know, and that's what the Mass Black Coalition and others were calling for, right? So even in our, you know, we need to shift our lexicon, because our imagination is too narrow to get us free with the current language and traditions that we have.
Now, y'all, Malia has spent several years at MIT. She is back there now, certainly doing the intellectual research, analytical thought leadership to back up all of the things that she's saying. But
I'm hella smart.
But what is also so impressive is that she has been in a company, in a bank, actually implementing the things that she's talking about. And so, Malia, what does this look like in practice? And I will brag on you, continue to brag on you, but I also want to just offer, had the great pleasure of being brought in by Malia as a consultant to work with her on some of the transformation she was making internally. And the first thing I want you to address, and then just, lay it all out there for us, all the awesome things you've done, is you walking in the door and really being able to implement this philosophical shift in Lexicon by just looking differently at what we put on the balance sheet, right? This idea of what's a cost center and what isn't. So tell us a little bit about how you were helping to boost and build Black and brown businesses in your work.
Absolutely. The CEO of the bank at the time, Richard Murata, was very dedicated to this notion. I like to say he's an Italian from New York, so he doesn't like to be bullied. He doesn't like to, and what he saw when we walked around Mattapan, Dorchester, we walked around DC, right? He talked to folks, and what he saw was a group of people being bullied. And what he also saw, that there was potential, that the capital potential there was something that we haven't even begin to fathom, and I think Citigroup said that that bias is costing us $16 trillion in our economy. And, I don't know if he would have said the number was that high, but he knew that we were leaving money on the table, right? And he knew that because he experienced that, and he saw that diverse teams were more profitable, right? That they were more, that they were going to be more successful entering in new markets. And what I appreciate about what Richard did is he really trusted me in bringing organizing into the bank. And so he didn't just want me to do trainings. As a matter of fact, I didn't do diversity trainings from my position. But what I did was figure out, how do we capture this new market? And how do we capture it responsibly? Because again, our current lexicon says, well, Black and brown are poor, they're going to end up with overdraft fees, and we're not going to make any money. And the first event that we did, Aisha, you remember, because you were helping me, was at Martha's Vineyard with Valerie Jarrett, where Richard joked that he was, one of the poorest ones in the room. He was like, oh, one of the poorest dudes in the room. And the reason why that was important was because it was, again, important for us to shift our thinking, right? And shift our thinking from, from that we only have to be thinking about this from, the least of these, right? That there's actually a spectrum of Black people, and you can develop, and brown people, and you can develop products to service all of them. And some of them you already have. The stat that I think really should challenge every bank is that 50% of Black and brown families are underbanked versus 19% of white families. That lets us know it's not a class thing, right? Like, if you would have Venn diagrammed the class, you would have many families in that 50% that could hold mortgages the same way the 20th percentile, right, of the whites who are then being able to be banked. So that's where your products sit. And once you do that, what you also see is that white folks don't want to, a lot of people, our current, our new consumer is changing. And, and whether they're white, Black, brown, people don't necessarily want to give to businesses that are doing bad, right? Like, they care about that more than they did before. And so it gives you something to talk to all of your customers about. The couple things that I want to talk about what we were able to do. The first one I could not have done without BECMA. And this, again, gets into the importance of relationship-driven change. We need to figure out how to be in relation with one another that allows us to test products, right? Because we can't just turn over the whole bank, right? But that allows us to test products and develop products in a safe and responsible way. And so, I think one of the examples that I'm the most proud of was around PPP. And Shagun from BECMA, as you all know, because this is a BECMA thing, but Grace Moreno from the LGBTQ chamber, they called me and they said, our businesses are being destroyed like today, right? The city and the state shut down. And within a week, right, we had businesses that were watching all of their catering money go away, right? All of the revenue that they had planned for. And so we started to develop the futures fund and this line of credit. And we had to talk, right? Because I was like, this is going to be sitting in the bank's books. And we were able to find ground that my chief risk officer and chief credit officer were comfortable with. Right. And so we were able to move that out. Now, could we have just put out this line of credit like all willy-nilly to like anyone? Well, no, but you and I know as two Black people, we ain't loaning money to all Black people. You know what I'm saying? Like, right? I mean, so that part isn't the racist part. The racist part is that it seems to be all Black people fall in that category, right? Like, and so, so you find ways to do character-based lending. You find ways to look past the institutional and structural oppression that keeps things like credit scores, right? That keeps those institutional, criteria that keeps us out. Because if it's institutional, we're probably not going to have been a part of it.
Yeah. When you talk about the fact that you worked with your risk officer to figure out a way, a formula, whatever it is that the bank would be comfortable absorbing this, it's a very different model than simply saying, oh, we're in a crisis. Let's figure out how our foundation can throw some grants to somebody to do something, right? Very different model. And I think that when you speak to this idea that we need to reimagine the lexicon, that is it. That always comes back to, the work that you were able to do to say, no, we're going to support communities who are disproportionately impacted economically. We're going to think about them in that way, right? So we're going to have a disproportionate solution, perhaps, to the effort that we put into managing the risk that they may pose based on these traditional metrics of whatever risk might be. That is the there of how this looks inside of a corporation, guys, or of a bank, specifically in financial services. I want to allow folks to weigh in if anyone has questions or thoughts for Malia. We do want to make sure you have a chance to do that. We've got about 20 minutes left, so feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'll just be monitoring those as we go along. But this experience for you, Malia, of having been a consultant to companies, helping to build out just your portfolio of boosting economic development in Black community in Boston is in and of itself really impressive, in a way that you're trying to build wealth for people and build community at the same time, different than just providing a service in community. I want you to just kind of give us a little bit more on that before I get you to share with people what you're up to next. But can you just walk us through a little bit about, your own, I'm just going to put it on you. You have done some work to start to build up a little miniature version of a Black Wall Street, if you will, in Boston. I know you've had your hand in some funds that have done some good investing. So tell us a little bit about what that looks like in practice also, as you're trying to help boost community.
So 7 years ago, I started or maybe it's 8. Gosh, Aisha, it's like, first of all, we've lived 10 years in this year.
Girl, we're still 28.
I'm like, 5 years ago, I'm like, oh, wait, that was 2008, right? Like, good Lord, no. But when we started Accelerate Boston, we started it because there was all this startup craze, and it was like Mass Challenge was coming out and all this stuff. And it was just like, yo, the bros are getting money in this thing called startup, right? Like, and we were like, well, how do we get money? And we had a bro, Greg Selko from karmaloops.com. And he had been in the VC thing, and he was like, and he needed the cool kids, right? I mean, he was running a cool company in Boston. And what he knew he needed was, the cool kids, I guess is the best way to say it. And so he was like, I want to start an accelerator for Black and brown fashion designers, creatives, right? So it wasn't even like we're looking for the next Google, or we're looking for, we're looking for the next Zoom or whatever. I mean, it was like, we're looking for the next like dope fashion designer. We're looking for the next, dope chef, right? Like just the things that make a community cool, which make the cool kids want to stay. Because what Greg was seeing was that he could recruit Black and brown talent out of universities here in Boston. That was easy. They would work here for 2 years and they would be like, peace, we're off to New York. Peace, we're off to LA, right? Like we're dope people of color who now have 2 years in retail experience, right? Like we're out to go live in a cool city. And he was having real trouble retaining talent. And so he wanted to help change the city. And so we started this accelerator. And when I first started it, I was like, this, for us, by us, right? And I started putting together like all, like the experts, like who were some billionaires in Boston who could come speak. And of course, the list ended up being like a lot of white men. And I was like, oh God, like what do we do? And so I was talking to one of my friends who's a white male, like the original white male, like Columbia, brown, right, has all the checks. And I was like, oh my God, what do I do? Like, here's the people that I'm bringing in. And he looked at, and he was like, there's 2 people on this list that I've been trying to get a meeting with. And he was like, so if you're not bringing these folks into Roxbury because they're not Black, he was like, then you're doing your community a disservice. He's like, because I, as a white boy, am trying to get a meeting with this dude. He's a billionaire. He's an angel investor. He, like we all want to get to Bill, right? Like, and you're bringing Bill in. And Bill was one of the first investors who gave to Fresh Food Generation, one of the sponsors of our event today. And, someone that probably many folks listening to this conversation will know about, right? So what I learned in building the accelerator was that we do want people who know business, right? We do need our white allies to come in, and most money still sits in the white, in white investment. So we do need that. But then what we need to do is we need to be able to, we need to be able to change how we see ourselves. And what that ends up looking like is a lot of getting out of scarcity mentality. And so when we were starting our accelerator, we actually ended up doing about 3 or 4 classes by the end that talked about like rich dad, poor dad stuff, right? That talked about the fact that we as Black people feel a certain way about credit, right? We feel a certain way about owing a bank money. We feel a certain way about taking risk. And those things are critically important for us to undo in our own head. So, when we put on a suit and get ready to pitch, we're like, yeah, we need $10 million and we'll give you a 20x return. Okay, great. When can I expect the check? And not like, oh my God, what do I owe them? What do I, if your business plan is solid, get credit to start your business, right? And
which is, by the way, part of the reason that you are working to shift this lexicon, because those ideas of inferiority or of owing and having a debt to and being anxious about that are all because of the way that the power dynamics and structure have been, of the way that this capitalist society has treated our opportunities.
Right, it's how we've been trained. Right. Yep. So if you think about like the home ownership efforts in Chicago back in, I think it was the 20s, what did they do? Right. They said, okay, we'll let Blacks have their little shack. Right. And you have to pay me rent every month because you're renting to own. And then if you're late a day, if you're whatever, boom, you lose the whole shebang. Right. Mm-hmm. We have been trained that that there's no room for you to fail financially. And yet we have a current president that somehow, like, I don't even know how you get 500 million in debt. Because to me, if you ain't paid back the first 100 million, how does someone give you more? So like, so obviously this is a different set of rules, because obviously you can owe someone $100 million and then owe someone else another 400, like, I mean, it's insane. We're
Mm-hmm.
those opportunities. Now, why was he given that opportunity? Because he went and he told the banks, if you stop funding me now, you're not going to get your money back. I'm Trump. I'm about to do the apprentice. Don't worry, dude. The money's going to keep flowing. And they floated him. They floated him for that. We don't get those opportunities. So we've been trained to say, don't take the risk, because if you mess up, you're going to lose everything. And the fact of the matter is that if you're planning properly, if you have a well-tested business plan, not that you and your friends say, oh, this looks good, we think we can do this business, but an actual well-tested business plan, then it probably makes sense for you to take the risk. And to your point, again, back in the lexicon that we had, is that risk is something, I mean, it's bad enough just being black, right? Like that's risky enough walking down the street. And now you want me to put my hopes and dreams and then my daughter's future, and we're talking about it in a way of race, but I think it's also class. I mean, my white side is Italian, working class from Jersey. And most of my family is still like, when is Malia going to get a job? And when I got a job at the bank, like, that was the first job that they could wrap their head around. And they were like, oh, she's finally getting healthcare, right? Like, so I was both, I think that there's also a class thing about risk, right? That poor people are, and so maybe, and that would be something interesting to look at, but I do think that our own internal lexicon, if we're talking about being like Black kings and queens, well, I'll tell you what, Black kings and queens take credit, right? They trade, right? They understand deficits, right? And so it's about us taking our empowerment lexicon that we have and applying it to the white lexicon that we're being faced with in American capitalism.
All right, I got a couple of questions that are coming through for you, but before I jump into those, I want to ask you, you talk about housing, right, in Chicago, you mentioned Trump, and the real undercurrent of this is that while we can critique the capitalistic society, government has been extremely complicit in so much of this. And so now that we've got a new administration coming in, what would you tell Vice President Kamala Harris and what would you tell President Joe Biden about what they should be doing differently in the various minority business enterprise offices at every agency that's throwing this grant to this and that and trying to spark small business, whatever's? What would you advise that government do or get out of the way with in order to help to also so that they can be co-conspirators in resolving the issue that they ultimately perpetrated all these years?
So the first thing I would say is reparations, just because I'm talking to the president and vice president, and this idea of economic repair. I think should be our theme for at least 10 generations. This idea of atonement, economic atonement, right? Economic repair. But what the government needs to do is the government needs to help corporations redefine and mitigate risks. So, when I think about it from a financial institution, I think about it as, how can the FDIC incentivize banks to take risks to enter new markets, right? And how can we make the $80 billion check cashing industry seem like banks might want to get a chunk of that 80 billion, right? Because right now banks don't touch it. I think there's ways to incentivize that through government. But what I think, the larger picture is that we actually need a new lexicon, but a new agenda around what the American economy and the American dream is. And I think, again, all the policies in the world, cool, we'll kill them. Whatever they are, you know what I mean? Like, you teach us how to read, the Bible will get our freedom, right? Like whatever it is, we'll run with it. We got the ball. But it's the field we're on that I think we don't spend enough time. We just say, run, y'all, run, and it's like, but there's alligators, there's, like, let's clear the field a little bit. And that's what I would talk about. How do you look at your agent? How do all of your agencies begin to have room to innovate and innovate towards access to capital? That's what we need. And we need technical assistance because we need to build business acumen amongst ourselves. But access to capital, and that should be some grants, sure. But I want to be able to do it the way the white boys do it, and again, I'm someone who I don't even know if I would choose, right, to have a big global company that exploits China instead of Black people here. But if that's what you like, but we should have the opportunity to do that because I think we would do it in a different way. Hopefully some of us would. And, that's really some of the thinking I'm doing now at MIT Sloan is not only introducing Sloan to new communities and not new leaders, but leaders that they haven't been introduced to yet. But I'm also putting a stake in research around if the culture economy, meaning, arts, entertainment, sports, gambling, if things like that, if that's what we're going to have a chance to build wealth in, which it seems like we will, right? From our First Nations people who are getting casinos, right, to athletes who are now, sharing some of the money that comes in from sports. If that's where Black and brown people are starting to make money and we're seeing them, how can they best leverage that? And, you see some of that with Killer Mike buying a bank, right? With Jay-Z starting a fund, with Alicia Keys sitting on this $1 billion fund. And I'm excited about that. I think that's the top 1% of this idea of a Black and brown economy. And I think that we can, we know trickle down doesn't work, but I think we can bubble up locally, and if the vice president wanted to take this on, right? If she wanted to take on from Main Streets to MLK Boulevard, right? Ensuring that the local economies could thrive with Black and brown businesses. The larger ones who will already get bought in, will also be found. But it's about making up for that gap. Most businesses aren't Fortune 100 businesses. Like, that's why they're on that list. But most businesses can hire a few folks in town and can pay them a decent wage and can help them send their kids to college.
We have a question came in that kind of is along the lines of what you're discussing. They're asking, so as you're imagining how we would get to this a stronger economic system for Black folk, question comes in that asks, well, what might you see as the KPIs or benchmarks that would help support that path? I know you started off kind of talking about how we might not have the right thought track about data, but we're trying to get to this, pathway to this, Black-driven economy, and there is the 1% version of it the cultural economy. What is your thought about KPIs and benchmarks, knowing that they're important?
I think this is a great way to bring us back into full circle, which is they're good if they acknowledge the culture that you're in, and if they actually get to the impact you're trying to have. So Aisha, you and I worked in politics for a long time, and we remember when the KPI used to be voter registration, right? How many people are registered? We got to register Black people. We got to register brown people. We got to register immigrants. How many people are registered? And then we're like, oh, wait, shit, they ain't voting. Okay, new KPI, right? Now we got to get people to vote. Hollis, Stacey Abrams, LaTosha Brown, right? They were like, okay, we got this. Hold my drink. We got this, right? So I almost want to say if the KPI is that our company is going to be more comfortable talking about racism today than it was yesterday, find a numeric way to measure that, that's fine. But you want your measurements to be tied to the outcome. So when a company says, we're working on diversity, so we have to hire Black and brown people, I say, I don't actually know if that's true, right? Because if you're a racist company, I don't want you hiring Black and brown people, right? Like, I don't know if that should be your KPI, right? Like, if you're just like, well, we're going to give $3 million to Black and brown people. Well, if you don't know any Black and brown people, you're going to end up giving them to probably shady ones, because those are the ones, that white folks tend to know, right? You know what I
Well,
mean? Like, you're like, you're going to be ended up giving them to the ones who work with the whites, right? Like, and then you're going to wonder why Black people aren't down. And it's because you have the leaders who only white people follow, like all of that, right? Don't set a KPI. Don't even begin to think about how you want to measure yourself until you understand what you want to change, and then from there set the KPI. So if you want to enter a new market, yeah, you should probably hire diverse people. If you want to go deeper into a market you already have, and you have no people of color, those are two separate problems, right? You get what I'm saying, right? Like, I think we so often, diversity becomes the answer, and diversity is the answer. But if you're not doing it smartly, and if you're not, you don't want to say we're going to hire Black people and then we're going to reach all of our metrics, right? Like that's too much pressure to put on your Black people as well. So it's not that I'm against KPIs. I think you need them, but I think you need them to measure things that are measurable, and you need to understand that they have limitations. The other thing is if your KPIs aren't tied to your balance sheets, right? Like, if you are not actually, if this isn't attached to, if Black people are not attached to your P&L, then you're not doing the work. And this is something, Aisha, I know you heard me talk about ad nauseum. But it was very important for me, and it's still very important for me, that the work I do is not charity. I did nonprofit work for a long time. I burnt out doing it. The work that I'm here to do is around liberation. And in America, that means building wealth.
there are at least 10 different quotes that I expect to be pulled out of this conversation and put on your face and sent around all over Twitter, because, yes, this is all about liberation. As a closing note, Malia, looking at our time, you've always talked about generational wealth and lack of generational wealth transfer for Black people as being, a real issue. Question came in that asked, as we are trying to imagine a new lexicon, how can we think differently, or how do we implement a new lexicon around this idea of generational wealth?
Great question. So I'm going to answer the question broadly, and then I'll get into the generational, and I'll be brief because I know the time. So we start by changing our lexicon, right? We start by not saying I'm a wife and mother, therefore I have to leave my job and be a caretaker during this COVID time. But we start about actually changing the stories we tell in our head, right? About ourselves and about who we are. So that's how we start changing it. And how do we do it around generational wealth? I think this is where we need to become comfortable with the systems that exist. And I started this conversation, and anyone who's heard me, again, no, I am willing to have a conversation about whether capitalism is the best economic structure for us. But being that I'm one of the only few, including my dear friend here, Aisha, who is like, no, capitalism is the best structure for us, move on. That is where we are. Cool, right? So if that's where we are, then if we're going to talk about generational wealth, then you have to have ownership, right? You have to have private ownership. You have to have investments, right? So you have to start participating in the white capitalist structure that is fraught with white privilege and white supremacy. And so if you're going to be building a new lexicon there, I think the most important thing for your children to remember is that they're going up against a much larger lexicon around whether or not they're worthy of ownership, and worthy of getting that type of credit and capital access. So if you own your home now, You want to talk to your family about the importance of that and about what that can leverage. If you don't own your home and you don't know if you will, you want to talk to your children about how they're going to own their home, right? And you want to get them comfortable with money and with going to the bank and with, you want to have a relationship with a banker regardless, so your children see that, right? Whether you have $5 in the bank or 500, every once in a while, walk into your branch, say hi, get to know folks. We need to be, if we want to participate, which we do, I'm not, and again, I'm not judging it. I love things. So if we are going to participate in that, then we are going to have to get comfortable navigating the racial microaggressions and the institutional, structural, and implicit bias that sits in capitalism.
Mm, mm. Well, there you have it, folks. Malia Lazu on her new lexicon for how we should think about building the Black economy and lifting Black entrepreneurs, etc. I want to thank BECMA for having us. Malia, you are fabulous, so fabulous. Congratulations to you.
Aisha, you are too. Thank you for joining me and doing this with me. It's been
I'm so
awesome
honored to
having you.
be here. So honored to be here. And I think you guys have a great day ahead of you. So we'll turn it back to the BECMA folks. Thank you.